Good evening. This is once again Professor Whitaker, and I am here as we are beginning to study the book of First Samuel and the book and the prophet Samuel as we begin here. And so let's begin and see how far we can get along on this. Today's goal is actually very simple. Today's goal, we're going to look at the overview of the book of First Samuel. So I'm going to give you the overview of the book, some of the key words again, and those kind of things. However, in the book of Samuel, we have three key figures that we're going to look at in different classes. We will briefly touch on the third, but the first one that we're going to look at in this particular class is the prophet Samuel. He takes up a good portion of the book of First Samuel, not in any of Second Samuel, but he does take up quite a bit of First Samuel. And then the next one that we will deal with is King Saul. And this is important because in King Saul is basically the latter part of the book of First Samuel. And within that latter part, we will also, and we will cover to a point, King David. Now, he wasn't king at that point, but um, we see what is happening here. David comes into play. Samuel anoints David, and then David is running for his life because King Saul is very jealous of him. And so these three key figures really take up the book of First Samuel, with the two major ones being Samuel and King Saul. Then in Second Samuel, we have the story of David, and so we will look at some of that here. Let's look at some introductory matters of the book of First Samuel. The Chronological Study Bible, which is an interesting study Bible, as it deals with various facets of the book being in chronological order, says the books of Judges and Ruth point toward the beginning of an Israelite monarchy. In the books of Samuel, the monarchy takes shape. In general terms, First Samuel tells of the beginning of the kingdom to the end of the reign of First King Saul. Second Samuel is devoted to the career of David, Israel's second and greatest king. And so you have these 2 points. But in First Samuel begins not with the king, but with the imposing figure of Samuel. Samuel is priest, he is prophet, and he is judge. Indeed, everything except king. And with him being the judge, that was a lot like a king, but it was not in the kingly fashion. It is from Samuel that the people seek a king. It is Samuel whom God sends to anoint first Saul, then David. It is Samuel who announces God's rejection of Saul, and when Saul's kingdom totters, it is from Saul's or Samuel's ghost that Saul seeks advice and learns that he is to die. Bruce Wilkinson and Kenneth Boa again states that Samuel, the last judge and first great prophet in Israel, anoints the first king. Now we will come back to this, but Samuel's the last judge, and judges, unlike the kings, were a combination of leaders, but they were also spiritual leaders as well. If you remember, up to this point, it's a theocracy, which means God is the king. God gives direction. And so all of the leaders, from all of the Moses, Joshua, all of the judges to a certain point, up to Samuel, not only is a ruler, if we want to use that term, not a king, but a ruler, a leader, but also a spiritual leader. And each one of the judges bring about a revival. The one that might be questionable is that of Samuel, but again, or Samson, but again, all that was done, God used that to create havoc on the Philistines, of which he was judging to liberate his people. And so Samuel was the last of that. But then when the king is elected, Samuel begins this order of prophets, which in its own right, if I can say it this way, continues the judgeship. It was not a succession of a family. It was a God calling, and it a lot of times was not from the family, just like the judges were not from the same family. And so you have Elijah, who anointed Elisha, who was not family, to become the next prophet. And so you saw schools of prophets, and prophets occupied, as we get into First and Second Kings, and even into Chronicles, which is basically a retelling of First and Second Kings. When you look at that, you will see the power and the prestige of being a prophet. In fact, the kings had prophets. Many of them, it became apparent that they catered to the king's wishes, and did not really get their messages from God. If you remember the story, which we will get to, of Jehoshaphat and King Ahab, they were getting ready to go to battle, and they wanted to see if there were prophets. And some of the king's prophets, King Ahab's prophets, prophesied prosperity. Oh, you're going to go in, you're going to destroy the other kingdom, and God's going to give you victory and all of this. Jehoshaphat was uneasy. He said, "Is there not a prophet of God, or a true prophet?" Now, what is interesting, these other prophets a lot of times were claiming to be prophets of God, but in a lot of ways, they were not. And there was one prophet, if you remember, and Ahab said, every time he comes to me, he always gives me bad news. But Jehoshaphat said, bring him here. And of course, when he comes, he says, oh, everything's going to be wonderful. And King Ahab said, I've told you not to do this, and you tell me. And he said, all right, I'll tell you. And he said, you're going to die. And didn't give a very flattering word from God. And so that plays into this quite a bit. And so Samuel transitions from judges to leading and ruling the people, to now just becoming a leader in spiritual matters, and one that challenges kings that did not follow through on God's plan. Though Saul's physical credentials are impressive, His indifferent heart attitude toward God results in the kingdom being taken away from his family. In his place, Samuel anoints young David as the king elect. David becomes a growing threat to the insanely jealous Saul, eventually fleeing to the wilderness for his very life. But God's hand of protection is clearly upon David, even as God's hand of judgment is being felt by Saul and his family. Foolishly consulting a medium at Endor, Saul hears his own doom pronounced, and true to the prophet's word, Saul and his sons are killed the next day in combat. Discovering the Old Testament, a book that we used to use for Old Testament survey, says the book of Judges closed with the observation that Israel had no king during the early days of the nation's existence in Canaan. This closing statement sets the stage for the next set of the Deuteronomy history. And remember, the Deuteronomistic history is basically that history that is based on Deuteronomy, where Moses says, if you do good, I will bless you. If you do bad, I will curse you. And so it's following out. In fact, if you remember when we started in the introduction, we said that the historical books is following this promise that God made. You honor me, I'll bless you. You curse me, or you turn from me, and I'll curse you. I'll send problems. I'll send pestilence. I'll send you into captivity. And it happens. We're now setting the next stage for this. The book of 1 Samuel relates the story of how Israel made the transition from the spirit-equipped, charismatic military leadership of the judges to the more permanent institution of kingship. This book is named after Samuel, who was Israel's last judge and first of the prophets. He occupied the place between the era of the judges, the pre-monarch period, and the era of the statehood and kingships, the monarch period. He thus stood at the crossroads of divine rule and human rule. He, like Moses and Joshua, challenged Israel to trust in God alone. Interesting facts about 1 Samuel, and we want to look at, because there's two key things that happen in Samuel, especially 1 Samuel. The book is all about transition. The book is big to the Israelite history in that it shows the transfer of power from the last judge to a king. It continues that transition from a strong first king that did not choose to obey God to a second king that the Bible calls a man after God's own heart. And so truly, transition is a mighty part of the book of 1 Samuel. Also, another interesting fact is that the book introduces, and I won't deal long with this because I've already dealt with it, introduces the concept of prophet. Samuel established, and though his actions set the tone for what a prophet should be in Israel. And if Samuel was not the greatest prophet in Israel history, he was at the top. I would almost say he was one of the greatest prophets. However, some would argue that Elijah was that. He truly was the first prophet of Israel. That we cannot deny. So what about some of the backgrounds of the book of 1 Samuel? The author of the book of 1 Samuel is anonymous. But many scholars believe that Samuel wrote the first part of the book, and then the prophets Nathan and Gad wrote the rest of the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. In fact, in the notes there, which I will let you read through here, there's some internal evidence of Nathan and Gad's writing of the book of 1 and 2 Samuel. Obviously, we know after Samuel's death, he could not write that. The date of the writing of First Samuel alone is 971 BC to about 722 BC. The setting is obviously the country of Israel, as is the writing, the place of the writing. It was all in the same place. The theme of the book of First Samuel is a book that traces the transition from judges to kings. And as we said before, of the first two judges. Excuse my wife, I'm sitting in the wrong place here as I'm doing this. The book teaches that God is still in control even when his people challenge his sovereignty. The purpose is to record the life of Samuel, Israel's last judge and first prophet, the reign and the decline of Saul, the first king, and the choice and the preparation of David, Israel's greatest king. What are some of the keys? The key words, as you probably guessed, was transition. This book is all about transition. The key verses is 1 Samuel 13:14 and 1 Samuel 15:22. The key characters, 1 Samuel, or that should be the key chapters, I'm sorry. The key chapter is 1 Samuel 15. This chapter records the tragic transition of kingship from King Saul to King David. And this is a horrible time, but we will look at this in next week's lesson. The key people is Samuel, Saul, David. Those three, as we've already pointed out, they are the key people in the book of 1 Samuel. The facts of the book of 1 Samuel, and let's look at some of these. Christ is seen in the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel is a type of Christ in that he was prophet, priest, and king or judge. Also, David is regarded highly as one of the prominent Old Testament types of Christ. And so Christ is seen in these books. How does it contribute to the Bible? Historically, 1 Samuel provides the crucial link from the judges to the monarchs. It is a fast-moving narrative that gives a spiritual perspective on three very different personalities whose lives were very much interwoven. And this is rather interesting. So I have here a small outline of the book of 1 Samuel. And really, it's broken down into two main points: Samuel, the last judge, and Saul, the first king. And you'll see some other parts of it. The first 7 chapters cover Samuel's judgeship, and then from chapter 8 on covers the reign of Saul. And throughout that, Samuel is involved. And so let's look at, as we look at this, let's look at some of the things of the book of Samuel as we conclude here some of our look at the book of 1 Samuel. The geography of the life of Samuel involves around these areas. In fact, if you have a study Bible, a lot of them will have a map. And mine has a map that really has these areas already listed, and it's in a very small area, but you have Ramah, which is it's about 6 miles north of Jerusalem. It was the prophet Samuel's birthplace, judicial residence, and the place of burial. And so we have, this is Samuel was he was born in Ramah. He also lived in Ramah, and he was buried there. Another place that we see that Samuel visits quite a bit, in fact, it's commonly called Samuel's northern office, was Bethel, which is 5 miles north of Ramah, and it was at Bethel, I believe it was, is where the temple was, or the tabernacle was set up. And No, I'm sorry, that was at Shiloh. But Bethel is quite a important factor. Um, it it was one of the four highest points in the land. The others being Mount Ebal, Hebron, Mizpah, and the view over the land from Bethel was magnificent. 800 years before Samuel, Jacob saw the heavenly ladder descending at Bethel. Then we have Mizpah, 3 miles west of Ramah. Uh, this is his western office, and here Samuel set up the Ebenezer stone. On its northern slope was Gibeon, where Joshua had made the sun stand still. Then in Gibeah, about halfway between Ramah and Jerusalem, was Saul's home. And then you have Bethlehem, David's birthplace, and later the birthplace of Jesus, was 12 miles south from Ramah or Ramah. Shiloh, about 15 miles north of Ramah, was the abode of the tabernacle from Joshua to Samuel, where Samuel ministered as a child. And then we have Kiriath Jearim, where the ark was kept after its return from the Philistines, was about 8 miles southwest from Ramah. And so you have some of these things. One of the things, as we look at the life of Samuel, we see various things as you begin, excuse me, as you begin in the first chapter of Samuel. We see his birth and childhood. The book opens and says there was a certain man, and it gives his name, Elkanah. Excuse me. And the Bible simply says he had two wives. And so I want to deal just a little bit here with this concept, because polygamy has flourished where women have occupied a low station in society. Israelites such as Elkanah, who had several wives, were following the culture of that time. The rivalry of the wives was related to the desire of a child and was marked by jealousy, struggle, taunts, and scheming. If you want a perfect picture of this, you go back to one of the patriarchs, and you go back to Jacob's, and you have Leah and you have Rachel. And although they were sisters, there was a warring between those two ladies, because Leah had children. Rachel was not able to have children, and that was a cause of tension. However, Jacob loved Rachel, and he didn't love Leah as much. And so because of that, naturally so, he would spend more time with Rachel than he would Leah. And that made Leah jealous. Rachel was jealous because Leah had children. Leah was jealous because Jacob spent more time with Rachel, and it caused a lot of problems. There was struggles, there was taunts, there was scheming to try to compensate. And we see some of this here in the first chapter of Samuel. And Hannah was one of Elkanah's wives, Peninnah, his other wife, and they had sons. And this created some issues, because Hannah was barren and she wanted a son. And the other wife would taunt her and make fun of her because she was barren, and it really bothered Hannah. And we find in chapter 1 that they go to the temple, as they always did, and Hannah was fasting, and she was weeping, she was crying, she was having uh, really some difficulties, and she went into the temple um, to pray. And as she was praying, she was not praying out loud. She was praying in her spirit and mouthing words. And the Bible says in verse 10 that she had a bitterness of soul. Eli happened to observe her in her praying. And her prayer was, she prayed a vow to God, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thy handmaiden. What was the affliction? The taunts, the problems that she was having with the other wife. And remember me, she says, and not forget thy handmaid, but will give unto thy handmaid a man child. Then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. Again, we see Eli looking at her, and he assumes, because she's mouthing words and not saying anything, that she's drunk. And he chides her for being drunk, and she says, she said, I am not drunk, but I'm a woman heavy of heart, and I've poured out my soul to God. And Eli said, go in peace, and God will grant your petition. Had no idea that she was praying for a man child. And so he just says, God's going to grant your petition because you're pouring out your heart in earnest. And they go back home, and sure enough, Hannah has a son. Now, what is interesting, Hannah, it appears in this story, is the favored wife, much like Rachel, who is barren. And so Samuel was born, and she did not go back to the temple until actually it was time to give Samuel back to the Lord. And again, the time of when this actually happened is we're not completely sure of exactly when this took place. Some scholars believe that it could have been anywhere from age 3 to age 5, and maybe even a little older, that he would be considered weaned. It wasn't necessarily that he was no longer feeding from his mother, but was able to handle food on his own, and was strong enough to handle things. They would consider a child to be weaned. So again, we're not sure the exact age, but she takes him, as she's promised, back to God. Now, everybody in Israel knew of Eli's his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and the wickedness that they were doing. They would desecrating the priesthood. They would make women lie with them, and immoral acts, and for favors. They would take of the meat before it was being boiled, and take what the hooks brought out. They would ask for certain kinds, and they were just wicked. God was upset with Eli for not dealing with his sons, but Eli seemed to not really care. And the worst that he did to his sons, according to the Bible, the worst that he did was simply swatted them on the hands and said, don't do that, sons, that's not good. And God said, because that you dealt with them that way, I'm gonna remove you from the priesthood and your family from the priesthood. what a terrible indictment. Instead of him coming down as the head of the home and saying, "You boys are wrong, and I'm taking you out of as priests because you're not doing right." No, he just simply swatted them, so to speak, on the hands, and they continued doing what they were doing. But Hannah um, takes her son back to God, gives them to Eli, and she brought him uh, every year a coat and some provisions to see him. Chapter 2 talks about Hannah's prayer of thanks. And also, chapter 2 tells about how Samuel serves God in the temple. And from being a child, he was obedient. He did what Eli wanted, and uh, just was a complete opposite of Hophni and Phineas. And then um, we have as we move into chapter 3 that we see here in chapter 3 that God speaks to Samuel. And again, we have these words that are prominent throughout historical books, especially the first part. Chapter 3, verse 1, and the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli. And notice this next part. And the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. What that basically simply means here is this fact that God was not revealing himself to his people as he had before. There was no open revelation. Remember in Proverbs where it says, where there is no vision, the people perish. That word vision in Proverbs is the same word here, open vision. And it simply means a divine revelation. And it was during this time, and if you go back to the end of chapter 2, we have a prophet speaks to Eli and tells him, God has sent me, and he's going to destroy your family because you have not dealt with them properly. Eli knows all about this. One night when Samuel goes to sleep, he hears a sound that says, Samuel, Samuel. And he jumps up and he says, here am I. And he runs to Eli, here am I, for thou calledest me. And Eli says, I didn't call you. Go back. You're hearing things. And he goes and lies down again, and the Lord calls him again, Samuel. Samuel arose and went to Eli, but you did call me. Samuel and Eli said, no, I didn't call you. You're hearing things. And he goes back the third time, and God again comes to him, Samuel. And he rises, and he says, you did call me. And Eli finally perceives that God is talking to Samuel. And he says, Samuel, go and lay down as before. And if the voice comes again, say, speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. Samuel goes and lays down. God calls again, and he says, speak, for thy servant heareth. And God told Samuel exactly what the prophet told Eli. In the morning, Samuel is now worried because he doesn't know what is going to happen. And he doesn't really want to share what God has told him. But Eli says, don't spare a thing, son, tell me. And Samuel did. And it only confirmed what the prophet said. chapter 4 talks about a war with the Philistines. And they have gathered, um, pitched beside Ebenezer, close to Mizpah. And here they're fighting with the Philistines. And the Philistines are putting a hurt on Israel. And so much so that the Israelite people are saying, man, we're going to be destroyed. And they come up with this wonderful idea of bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the camp of the Israelites and letting the Ark of the Covenant, go with them into battle. And let's see if that will bring God's glory. And so Hophni and Phinehas bring the Ark of the Covenant. When it comes into the camp, they shout, and the Philistines are worried. They say, "Wow, it sounds like a sound of battle." And they and so the Philistines gather, and they go out, and instead of the Ark of the Covenant helping them, they're soundly defeated, and the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines. There are those that come back, and in the process, they kill Hophni and Phinehas. They come back, and a messenger comes by Eli. He's sitting on a bench. And according to scripture, he was 98 years old, but he was a heavy man. And the messenger came. He said, "What of the battle?" And the messenger said, the Israelites have been defeated. Hophni and Phinehas, they killed your two sons, Eli. And the Ark of the Covenant is captured. And notice verse 18, because it was not Hophni and Phinehas that caused Eli's death, although you would think it would have been. I wonder if at that news he was thinking, I now do not have to deal with my sons. But notice verse 18. And it came to pass, when he made mention of the ark of God, that he fell off the seat backwards by the side of the gate, and his neck brake, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy. When he heard that the Ark of the Covenant was gone, it caused great problem until he probably, no doubt, reeling back in despair, and he went back too far, toppled off of his seat, fell on the ground and broke his neck and died. The Ark of the Covenant was in captivity. You know the stories. Wherever the Ark of the Covenant went, there was a plague that would break out. And they first of all take it to the house of their god, Dagon, which Dagon was a fish god. He was part man, part fish, scales. And so the Philistine soldiers were dressed, their armor was literally scales. They looked like fish with legs. And so you can imagine when David faced Goliath, that he looked like a giant fish. Their whole armor was that way, covered in scales. And the next day, Dagon had fallen on his face before the ark of the Lord. And they set up Dagon again. And then the next day, when they came in, Dagon, the image of Dagon had fallen again. And the head and the palms of his hands were cut off from the threshold. Only the stump of Dagon was left to him. And so they, therefore, neither the priest of Dagon nor any that came into Dagon's house would tread upon the threshold of Dagon because of this. And the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them at Ashdod, and he destroyed them and smote them with emerods. Now, and I want to be careful because I know there's women in this class as well, but for us to understand this, emerods was simply hemorrhoids. He plagued the Philistines with a bad, very bad case of hemorrhoids. If you've ever had hemorrhoids, you cannot sit. You are not comfortable in any fashion at all. It is very uncomfortable. And so they began to move the ark around, but everywhere it went, they this plague would break out, and finally they were going to move it to another city, and the people said, "Oh, no, 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 no! You're not going to bring that here, no way!" And so they finally said, "Let's." If this is really of God and not something that just happened out of the blue, let's put the Ark of the Covenant on a cart with two heifers that have young calves. And if they walk away toward Israel, we know that it was the hand of God, because they will not leave their calves. And that's exactly what happened. And the plague was stayed. It came back to the place of Kiriath Jearim. We looked at, and it stayed there for quite some time, and God blessed the people. And there was actually, as it it came to a certain place of Beth Shemesh, and they saw the ark, was all excited about the ark, and they looked inside of it, and God smote the people for looking inside of it. And you weren't supposed to do that. You weren't supposed to touch it. And however, it finally came to Kiriath Jearim, and they kept it for 20 years. Now, 20 years have passed since the defeat with the Philistines. And during that 20 years, Samuel has risen to the position of judge and priest. The people are looking towards Samuel. And again, the Philistines began to flex their muscle. And they said, 20 years ago, we defeated the Israelites. Let's do it again. And they come up against them at Mizpah. And the people cry out, and Samuel goes before them. They pray. They offer sacrifice to God. And the Philistines drew near as before, and God thundered a great thundering and discomforted the Philistines, and they were smitten before Israel. And they put a hurt, if you want to put it that way, on the Philistines. And the Philistines were subdued. And this is where we preachers will preach from this passage on the stone of Ebenezer. And Israel put up a stone there at Mizpah, and they called it Ebenezer, which simply means hitherto hath the Lord helped us. And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. And he went from year to year in a circuit. And but we see in chapter 8 that Samuel is getting old. And he made his sons judges over Israel. But his sons, notice verse 2 or verse 3 of chapter 8, and his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes and perverted judgment. Now, for you that are taking this class for credit, one of the discussion boards this week is simply dealing with the fact of Samuel following in the footsteps of Eli. Now, Samuel was not like Eli. We know that. But Eli did not deal with his sons. Samuel, apparently, his sons did not follow in the same path that their father followed. And it's sad. A very sad plight. In so much that Israel wanted nothing to do with Samuel's sons being judges over them. In fact, they said, we want a king. Was it because Samuel followed Eli's parenting skills that he saw? Or could it have been that Samuel was so busy with the work of the church that he did not spend time with his family to train them in the right way? I have watched many pastors that have become so consumed with God's work that they literally neglected their family. I know of a great evangelist, a man that helped start a denomination. They came out of another denomination. A man who was absolutely phenomenal in a lot of people's books. But I am told I was not there at his funeral. And I've heard this of a couple of great evangelists, holiness evangelists. But at this one I'm thinking of, that his children, his sons especially, did not show up to their dad's funeral. And when asked why they didn't, they simply said, Dad never had time for us. We don't have time for Dad. Think about that. In all of his doing good, in all of his wonderful work for the church and for God, he sacrificed the most precious thing that he could take to heaven. You're not going to take churches. You're not going to take a conference. You're not going to take a lot of things. You do take your children. You can take your children. And he neglected them for the work of the church. I'm not saying that all pastors have done that. But I know as a pastor, that was one of my biggest struggles, was how to spend time with my family so that they would not feel that they were neglected. And that was a hard balance. Maybe that was Samuel's deal. Don't know. I'm wondering. Or was it that he simply was mimicking what he was taught by Eli? And you remember, God spoke to Samuel and told Samuel what Eli was doing wrong. But so often, as I'm working on my doctorate, and we're studying leadership, so often the leadership style that I portray now is what I observed in other people. And even though I know it may not be right, it is hard for me to make that change because that's what I've watched. That's what's been mentored. That's what's been presented to me. And I pick it up and I mimic it. Um, Nobody's parents are perfect. All right, nobody's parents are perfect. And there were things that, uh, and let me give you an example. Let me give you an example. Some of you watching this know my parents. I love my mom and dad. In fact, the older I become, the more I appreciate them because you understand why they did some of the things that they did. And this is a prime story. So what I'm telling you, I'm not slamming my parents. Please do not misunderstand me. I remember as a teen boy and teenager and getting up into my teen years, we had a little pond in the back of our house. We had a little 12-foot semi V bottom aluminum boat that we would go fishing on. And my brother and we fished a lot, but it was always fun because at a certain point, Dad wouldn't let us get out in the boat by ourselves, and unless he was with us, and we wanted to go out in the boat because we just thought we could catch fish better in the boat than we could on the shore. And but I'll never forget, we would beg Dad to go fishing with us. And I'll never forget, Dad would say, "Boys, I'd love to, but I am wore out." And I thought, come on, what's so hard to do that? And I vowed, to be absolutely honest with you, I vowed that um, if I ever became a father, which I planned on it, and I have, I wouldn't do that. And for the first part, I was very good to play with my kids. We had our oldest son when we pastored at Newcastle. We had a sandbox. I'd go out, we'd build roads and play with army men and little plastic army men. We'd play. I'd spend time. But then I got older. My body started wearing out. I started getting tired. And my youngest boy wanted to go horseback riding with me at a park. And I told him, Brent, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. I haven't forgot you, Brent. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. And I'm looking at you today, and it still hasn't happened. He's married. He has little boys. What happened? I said I wasn't going to do that, right? But because that was what was shown to me, I followed. Now, again, please understand that's not a slam on my father. It's not a slam because I so much understand why he said he's tired. But I simply use that as an illustration. Was it because that's what was modeled? And maybe Samuel didn't want to do it, but he did it because that's what was modeled. Or was he so busy with church work? In the discussion post, you're going to need to answer that. I'm going to stop here with Samuel's life because um, we will see as we pick up next week when we start dealing with um, Saul becoming king, that um, Samuel is involved with this. And so as we look through the life of Saul, um, we're going to see how Samuel fits in there. And so I'm going to deal with Samuel in that particular point. And he was very much so involved. And we will see as we finish out this book that Samuel loved Saul, even when God rejected him. Samuel loved Saul and wept for Saul, even down to the end. And so the book of First Samuel is an interesting book. Lots of stories, lots of lessons. In class, I wish I had the ability to slow this thing down and spend an hour a day going through this, and I still would only barely scratch the surface. Um, let me challenge you with this as we close, because I think this is important for us. I have picked up and began doing this. Um, I actually did it. We had a ministerial president here at the college under me, Sean English, that challenged the ministerial organization to read through the book or through the Bible in 90 days. And I didn't hear the first announcement. He told me later. And so I was like a week or two when I found out about it, that he had started it. And I thought, well, if my some of my preacher boys are doing it as their sponsor and over the ministerial department, I need to do it. And so I started doing it. I started reading the Bible. However, I found out that it was hard to read the amount of chapters that was needed every day to finish in 90 days. So I downloaded an app. I went from my phone, and it's not here. I think it's down at the end of the table there. But there's an app called U Version, YOU version. And there's many apps, so this is just the one that I use. But the U version actually will read uh, several of the Bibles to you. And so I downloaded that app, and as I was getting ready in the mornings, uh, showering, brushing, not showering because you can't hear, but brushing my teeth, shaving, and that type of thing, I would listen to the Bible. And then times if I was working in my office that it didn't require a lot of thought to what I was doing, I would as well listen to the Bible. And in doing so, and listening to a lot of chapters, you begin to see things in a different perspective than just reading one chapter at a time. And I will be honest with you, that is probably when the historical books really came came alive to me. Um, it's always been of interest. Some of my favorite stories are throughout the historical books. Um, my all-time favorite story is David and Goliath, is found in the historical books. And there's so much that has intrigued me, but listening through the Bible, and listening to more than just one or two chapters, but four or five, six chapters, put you over a range that be honest with you, I haven't stopped. I listen to it every morning. And it just makes the Bible come alive. And so, if you get a chance, um, I used to have the Bible on cassette tape. And you can listen to it on cassette tape if you still have a cassette tape player. You can get the Bible on CD. You can get it on your phone. But listen to this and go through various chapters and listen as a whole. It will connect a lot of dots. It did for me anyway. That was why this, why this, why this, and all of a sudden when I read it in the wide view, boy, those dots began to connect. It's, oh, I see that, and it is fascinating, and especially through the rest of this, it really connected, and so I'm excited about that. So I would challenge you to do that through at least First Samuel, Second Samuel. It really makes the connections there. And if you remember, in the Jewish Bible, it's not First and Second Samuel. It's just the book of Samuel. And again, with Kings and Chronicles, it wasn't First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. It was just Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. It was all one book. So that is all for today. Thank you for listening, and we will conclude for today, and then we will pick it back up again next week when we talk about King Saul. Thank you so much.